This is wonderful. I'm so glad you're all here. As I said before, my name is Lynn Pegg, and I live here at Beckenwood, and we have a number of guests who don't live here, and I'm really happy to see that too. I organized and coordinated a delegation through Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective, and we all went, 18 of us, to Cuba in early December. I was fortunate enough that 5 other Beckenwood people came with me, so we had a tight little group. It was really wonderful. Next slide, please. When we first arrived, we went directly to the center, the Martin Luther King Center, which is like a small hotel / hostel developed by a Baptist pastor in Cuba about 30 years ago with Lucius Walker, who was the founder of Pastors for Peace. And they formed this idea that people from around the world needed to come to Cuba and see it. And so it is a hostel that serves international visitors, educational visitors. They also are aligned with a Baptist church right next door in that square, and they serve that neighborhood as well, and they are a neighborhood gathering center. In the upper right corner of the slide here are the 3 leaders that took care of us while we were there. Once the delegation of 18 arrived, I passed them off to these wonderful leaders. Sendor, the man on the left, is an employee of the center, Martin Luther King Center, and he was our local Cuban leader and expert. The man in the middle is El Delso, who is also an employee of the MLK Center, and he was our primary interpreter. He's a wonderful man. He used to be on the staff or the faculty of the university teaching journalism. And Sender, by the way, had been a lawyer, but he decided it was a little too boring for him, and he decided to go work for the center and take these delegations around, and he was a fount of information. He was wonderful. And on the far right is Jay, who is the employee with Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective. And he was relatively new to Witness for Peace, but he had worked for a year in Cuba with Pastors for Peace, so he was becoming more deeply immersed into the Cuban culture and was a wonderful person. He previously had been doing community organizing in Pennsylvania for single-payer insurance efforts. On the bottom was a banner that was on the front of the Martin Luther King Center, which said, "Build the future, break the blockade." And that was definitely the theme for our 10 days in Cuba. Okay, next slide. This is our wonderful group. Senator told us it was the best delegation he had ever had. He kept saying, "Hey, people, be over here." He was great. And for me, this was my 20th delegation that I had coordinated, and I would say, I'd attest to what he says, it was one of the most fabulous delegations you could hope for. It was like 90% elders, people over 65, and they were wonderful. And the 2 younger ones were pretty good too. But everybody kept up, everybody was on time, everybody was enthusiastic, and just wonderful learners, so it was great. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Linda.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try to give a little bit of a historical overview. And believe me, it's really difficult to turn the entire history of a country in about 3 minutes. So wish me luck. Cuba was settled by the Spanish conquistadores in the early 1500s. And these slides show the original Spanish fortress, which is the oldest stone fortress in Latin America, the cathedral, and the harbor in what is now called Old Havana. Next slide. Almost all the original natives, who were Siboney, Taino, and Arawak, were either killed or died of disease very soon after the Spaniards arrived. But the Spanish still needed labor for their coffee, sugar, and tobacco plantations, And so they imported slaves. They were imported in terrible conditions, like sardines in a tin. And if you look at that model of the slave ships, they were all on their backs, side by side, in layers on the ship, coming from Africa to Cuba. La Dionisia, up there in the upper left, we will hear more about it later, but it was a coffee plantation that we visited that was run on slave labor. Santeria was a blending of the native African religions with Catholicism, and it's still widely practiced in Cuba today. These are just two of the many orishas, or Santeria gods, part of a large display at San Severino Castle in Matanza that we visited. The castle is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site that commemorates what's called the Route of the Slave. More than 200 million slaves passed through here. Next slide. So Cuba has been called the key to the Caribbean, and you can see why if you look at that map. Up on the upper right, just for fun, at an art exhibition, factory, whatever that we went to, there was an entire wall-size map of Cuba and made entirely of keys. But if you look at that map, the United States, Mexico, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Turks and Caicos, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the Cayman Islands are all less than 100 miles from Cuba. And I don't think most of us realize how significant Cuba is to the entry into the Caribbean island. If you look at that map, Cuba pretty much blocks the entrance into the Caribbean. As early as the late 1700s, American politicians, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were already discussing the idea of annexing Cuba. Throughout the 1800s, the US followed something that we were fascinated by. It was the ripening fruit policy. In other words, waiting and watching until Cuba was ready to pick. Strong nations like England and France were kept away, while the much weaker Spain was encouraged to remain. When Cuba declared its independence from Spain in 1895, the US signed on as a partner because the fruit was ripe. When Spain admitted defeat in 1898, the United States prevented Cuba from participating in the peace talks and signing the treaty. And that treaty deliberately did not set a timeline for US occupation. Cuban military leaders were not even allowed to participate in the surrender ceremonies. As conditions of the victory, the US retained a military base in Guantanamo province. US companies established themselves in Cuba, and the US maintained a strong influence over the Cuban government. Throughout the next 60 years, the US government had a strong influence in Cuba. Business and tourism flourished, along with prostitution, drugs, and even involvement of the US mafia. The gap between rich and poor grew dramatically. Under Fulgencio Batista in the 1950s, this situation reached its height. Next slide. In 1959, Fidel Castro, and I would imagine most of you recognize him, his face is a fairly familiar face. He and a band of guerrillas led a revolution that grew in strength until Batista was forced to flee the country and go to Miami. A new revolutionary government was established which nationalized various industries and began campaigns for literacy and healthcare as its top priorities. Many wealthy Cubans fled to Miami. Together with representatives from the US companies that had been nationalized, they began a strong campaign against Fidel's government. A blockade of Cuba was informally established in 1959, but formally established in 1962 by President Kennedy, and it effectively forced the Cubans to turn to Moscow for economic help. Ironically, that then reinforced the incorrect perception that Cuba had become a communist country. Fidel's efforts to reach out to the United States with diplomacy were ignored or outright rejected. The blockade is still in force today, even though Cuba no longer depends on the Soviet Union and has not done so for more than 30 years. More on that later. Who's next? I believe Alan is next.
So, I'm coming at this from a public health perspective, partly because that is my background in public health. So the Cuban government operates a national health system and assumes fiscal and administrative responsibility for the health care of all of its citizens. So there are no private hospitals or clinics. All health services are government run. And, despite, there were major hardships after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but despite that, and despite the blockade, Cuba has achieved health indicators that are among the best in the world, I think, under really challenging conditions. Cuba, among other things, the only tropical country without tuberculosis. And in terms of medical care, the emphasis is on prevention. So prevention is the most important part. And since the revolution, there's been a strong emphasis on science, medicine, and literacy. And literacy, for example, went from 37% in 1959 to 100%, virtually 100% now. So one of the places we visited was a medical clinic, and they're served by these local clinics that have a nurse and a family doctor, and they actually live at the clinic. The clinic we visited, both the doctor and the nurse lived right over the clinic itself. And doctors can take as long as they want, or as long as they need. There's not the time pressure. They're available 24/7. And doctors and nurses will also go to the home to draft a family history. And so the client load comes from the immediate neighborhood. Dr. Barbara Romero, whose clinic we visited, area included 889 people. And again, they live directly above the clinic. And standard visits are like 1 to 4 times a year, depending upon health status. The patients can come to the clinic as needed. If a doctor is sick or on vacation, there'll be a sign on the door telling the patient where to go. There's a system for dentistry, for social services. There are behavioral problems, those are referred out to a psychiatrist. There's even a health system for pets to be sure they're vaccinated, which I found rather fascinating. So that was, in the 9 days. I mean, there were so many places we visited, lectures we heard. So that stood out as one that was really informative. Another was a visit to a Center for Alternative Medicine. And I don't know about you, but I had never heard of ozone therapy. It's been applied for more than 10 years in Cuba. I was curious and looked it up at PubMed, the National Medical Library, and got over 4,000 hits to articles published. It's been demonstrated to be effective for pain relief, cardiorespiratory issues, and as an anti-inflammatory. Most frequent route of administration is rectally, which doesn't sound like much fun. They also do things with cupping, electrodes, electrotherapy, ultrasound. They provide exercise and PT, and have a range of motion equipment, walking assistant devices. So we got a pretty good tour of that center. We also, for this kind of breathless tour, in 5 minutes or so of places we've been, went to the maternity care center in Matanzas. And this is intended mostly for young women with at-risk pregnancies or women who live in remote areas of the country. And the women are past 34 weeks. They have physicians, social workers, nurses, and dietitian. They do ultrasounds, medical consultations. And then when they go into labor, they're taken to a hospital which is 2.5 kilometers away. And the home does provide both physical and cultural activities. One thing that impressed me is that there have been no positive cases of COVID at the maternity center. And there is provision for new parents to take time off. At 34 weeks, women are eligible for leave of absence. Following birth, they receive full salaries for 6 weeks. So that, again, it's kind of the breathless tour. One thing that really stood out in my experience was we had a lecture from a specialist for molecular immunology and didn't realize some of the accomplishments, some of the research accomplishments, medical accomplishments. Now, Cuba is a country of about 11 million people, so think about the size. And they developed their own COVID vaccine, Abdala, and they had different formulas for different risk levels. You know, people with diabetes, high blood pressure, elderly, etc. And they started mass vaccinations in May of 2021 and reached herd immunity, considered to be 75%, by October of 21. And COVID, and people worried about us being there in Cuba, but COVID was almost non-existent. 95% of the population down to stage 2 had been vaccinated, and in fact, Cuba has a higher rate of vaccinations than any other country in the world. And there, I don't know the precise figure, but fewer than 1,000 COVID deaths in Cuba, and if extrapolated from their population of 11 million in the US, we would have had fewer than 30,000 deaths, and you know we had more than 1 million. And then some of the medical developments, breakthroughs, they have developed medications that have slowed the progression of Alzheimer's. They developed something called Heberprot P as a treatment for diabetic ulcers, which has been shown to reduce the likelihood of complex ulcers and amputations, and has been used in 15 countries. So the thing is, and there are a number of other things with vaccinations against HIV, a vaccine for lung cancer that by combining genes that's brought about increased life expectancy and reduced symptoms. And so all of this in the context of challenge for resources, the blockade, and yet Cuba's achieved health outcomes comparable to, and sometimes exceeding those of the US, and without the disparities we have here. When I was in Cuba, I was reading something about the New York Times about how a baby in Mississippi would fare worse than a baby in Rwanda. So, and they've achieved world-class medical breakthroughs, but have not been, one place that's our loss is they've not been fully shared with the rest of the world due to the blockade. So with that, I will turn it over to Lucia.
My name is Lucia. I live on the second floor, and had a wonderful time traveling in Cuba with my colleagues. My area of focus is on some of the programs for older people in Cuba, life and services for senior citizens. But I wanted to say something about the family culture in Cuba, which is quite different from what we are used to in the United States. You won't find any Beckett Woods, as far as I know, in Cuba, because people culturally or it's a cultural practice to intergenerational living, right? So many people live in even the same home, the same house or building where their parents and grandparents lived, and they lived there with, the older adults lived there with their sons or daughters and their grandchildren. So imagine this multi-generational family, imagine living there. As Alan said, the population of Cuba is a little over 11 million in the whole country. 75% of the Cuban people live in urban areas, okay? Now, an aside too, is that the life expectancy average for Cubans is 77.5 years, a little bit higher than the US average lifespan. I want to introduce you to the gentleman who is with our interpreter. Guillermo Rodriguez has a bachelor's degree in law, and he was a member of the working commission that drafted the new Code of the Families. Now, the Family Code was first established in Cuba in 1918, and it established some what's the word I'm thinking? Some safety net for people who were living within their families. One thing it did was establish specific laws regarding divorce and division of assets at a time of divorce. That was in 1918. And there have been some revisions in 1979, but people were aware that the code needed to be revised again. So starting in 2019, quite a diverse group of people, including Mr. Rodriguez here who spoke with us, met and redrafted the family code so that it could be returned to the population of Cuba in neighborhood groups where they would discuss and make suggestions and turn it back to this working group. And finally, the family code was passed by a referendum in September of 2022, and it included, it was passed by a 68% positive vote. Now, some of the things that were changes in the new family code, or the adapted family code, is there was recognized diversity in sexual orientation, so that marriage is now legal between two people. Taboos were eased regarding practices of certain African religions. There was a change in the legal age of marriage for girls, was bumped from 16 to 18. And there were special rights established for step-parents in a family. And especially interesting, as we met with some people, older adults, was that there are protections for elderly people, including financial protections. And inheritance may be granted to caregivers rather than just family members, which is an interesting process. So finally, that passed in 2022. It seems like an exceptional process and a positive new family code. We visited the Casa de Abuelos, which you know probably means the house of, or the home, the house of the grandparents. And we met with, these are community-based centers where people in the neighborhood, elderly people, can even walk to the centers, and they are devoted to countering social isolation of older adults. Because imagine if you are living in an intergenerational household and you're the senior and your kids go to work and the children and teenagers go to school, and the concern is that that elderly person was alone in the household all day. So the Casa de Abuelos, and I think in the next slide we met with some people. Yes, they spoke with us. And in this particular neighborhood, there were 24 women and 11 men participating in a variety of activities and classes. The center was open from 8 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock every day, and they were provided with breakfast, a snack, lunch, and another snack, and then would be on their way home by 3 o'clock. People could be referred by their community physicians when they might be perceived to be alone at home all day. So that was similar to a senior center where I used to work in the Twin Cities, and very understandably functioning and supportive of senior people. The next slide shows us a group who came to meet with us, and they were talking about two things. One was the transformation of the Cogolote neighborhood, and that was the neighborhood where the Martin Luther King Center was located, I believe. And it's a little hard to see, but you know the The style of housing is often what I think of as row houses and maybe 2 or 3 stories. It was concerning to me that some of them looked kind of run down, and the paint, you know, the salt air. But what I understand and what I realize is that because of the U.S. embargo and the U.S. sanctioning of other countries that would trade and sell products to Cuba, people who would paint their houses the bright, beautiful colors that they started out to be cannot get a hold of the materials they need. And that was very disturbing to us, especially because my roommate Nancy and I had to move to a different room because our toilet, which of course, well, it didn't flush, because when it was repaired with a new piece, the new piece didn't fit this old toilet. And so there's a big problem with the blockades. And these people were working on revitalizing and transforming the neighborhood, which was established in 1911, and that many people who live there now are the descendants of those first people who lived in the neighborhood. So they're not moving to the suburbs very, very often. It's just a really stable kind of family system. The next slide is the same group of people who talked with us. And here's another view of the neighborhood. They also are part of what they call the University of Senior Citizens. And these are also in community groups. And the people who become members of this University of Senior Citizens they take courses and learn about aging and learn about special issues of interest and importance to older adults. And the members would study and write, and they're very active there was a traveling choir that traveled out to other countries. They're active in drama, and they have fashion shows, they dance and sing, they created a cookbook. And the next slide will show you something that they did. Here's one active woman who is tossing the frisbee with us and others. One problem that they identified was that many of their children's or grandchildren's dolls were imported, and they were white, you know, kind of like Barbie doll looking dolls. And there had been, the tradition had kind of been abandoned of making dolls. So they started making dolls, and especially focused on dolls with black skin and darker skin, so that children would identify and know their dolls as part of their own family. So, that was wonderful. They made other things too, jewelry and so on. Nancy is going to talk about education, and I think that Alan did tell you that health care for everyone, no charge. And same is true about education. Here you go.
And I wanted to say one more thing about the family code, because when it went out to all those neighborhoods, there were over 2,000 amendments that came from the neighborhoods and made it up, and then it would go back down again. Most democratic process. It was amazing. So, this is the Latin America School of Medicine, which was started to serve medical students in the Americas. In 1992, there were 2 really bad hurricanes, and doctors from Cuba would go into the different countries that were affected, and they would go to places where the local doctors wouldn't even go. And then when they came back, they said, who's going to do the work now that we're not there? So in 1998, Fidel Castro created the Latin American School of Medicine, where students without resources could study. So there's no charge for this unless countries or the students are able to pay, but otherwise they don't have to pay. Castro's brother offered him the Navy Training Center that you can see. It's this huge building, beautiful place. He said he could have it ready for him in a year. Fidel says, 1 month, and so it was. And that's the first graduating class of, from 180 different countries. Well, the first graduating class had 1,500 students, so that's obviously not all of them. But most of the students weren't charged for the education. It was supported by the Cuban government. Next slide. Oh, here's the most recent graduating class with students from many of the 184 countries now studying at the medical school. So far, a total of over 30,000 students have graduated. The first 6 months, the students become fluent in Spanish. And then, from then and through the second year, they take the necessary pre-med classes. Following that, they have 4 years of medical training, and if they wish, they can continue for an additional 2 years to study a specialty. Upon graduation, the students return home to practice medicine in their home country. Castro said, "We don't send bombs, we send doctors." And there are the flags from some of the countries that have sent students to this medical university. The school is sometimes referred to as a small United Nations, where students learn from each other and develop an international understanding. Even the United States has students who study there. I think 218 to date through the Pastors for Peace organization. The school will even help students prepare for the board exams they need to take when they get back to the States. Interestingly, those that we met from this year were all from families who recently immigrated to the United States. During the Obama era, the number of students ballooned from 80 to 458 students initially. And then they took a big hit during the Trump administration and during COVID. Next slide. Oh, that one went with the stats I just gave you. But it lists the different countries and the different years and how many students from all over. Here we have students from a different school. A school for children with what they call special abilities. It covers preschool through 9th grade. There are 235 students, 40 of whom live in residence. They're taught to be self-sufficient and to see themselves as beautiful. It was delightful, and I think you can see some of the joy in their faces as they are putting on a little program for us. When the president of Panama visited the school early on, he was so impressed, saying his child never received the kind of socialization these children receive. Subsequently, he provided the school with the computers that they needed for their students. Just sent them a bunch of computers. The school, which started in 1989, is set up to accommodate whatever aids the students may need, with wide halls to accommodate the wheelchairs and things like that. Now there are 3 such schools in Cuba, and parents are able to send their children with no charge to themselves for doing so. This is a typical classroom. Grades up through 4th grade, there's 5 to 8 students per grade. The older grades have 12 to 15 students, and each classroom has a teacher and an assistant. There's 21 classes. These students in residence go home once monthly. At the school, they learn to make their own bed in the morning without assistance, developing a sense of real deep pride in themselves. The rehabilitation program has the most basic equipment, yet the most loving care is offered to prepare these students for life. There are many auxiliary services and specialists available to the children, including nurses, doctor, dentists, psychologists, to name a few. What was amazing to me was that not only were these specialists available to the students, but to their families, and indeed to the whole neighborhood that lived around there. They could all make use. Another example of how the Cuban people seem to focus on care for each other. Next slide. Lastly, we visited a high school that specializes in music and the arts. There are 166 students, 76 of whom live here, going home only twice a year. There is no charge to the parents for tuition or room and board. We heard from both teachers and students. The students attend their regular classes during the day and then music classes in addition, so they're busy all the time. We heard an amazing concert, which you heard part of, put on by various students. Let's listen to a brief snippet of a piano concert. Regularly participate internationally.
We'll hear more of her at the end.
Yes, we will hear more. And they regularly win awards. Some of the students shared with us their dreams for their futures. Everywhere we went, we were warmly welcomed by the people, who also told us very directly the impact on them of the blockade. Here at this school, they struggle to have access to quality instruments, so they just use whatever they can. They have trouble getting reeds for their woodwind instruments, resin for their violin bows, guitar strings, and dance shoes for ballet. Very simple things, but they have a really hard time getting them. The director of the school said to us, "These students are our truth."
I'm going to be talking about the arts, the really beautiful part that I love of Cuba. Their music is fantastic, singing, dancing, visual art, sculpture. They're incredibly expressive, artfully. And I wonder if it's something about being on an island and contained on an island and being blockaded on an island and having little material goods. But creative expression is free. So their art goes way back. I mean, there were primitive people who, indigenous people who lived before the Spanish arrived. And we did go to a museum where we saw some of the artifacts from that population. But also the Spanish colonists had a deep impact on its architecture from the early 1500s to the 1800s. All of Old Havana, which has been supported through United Nations UNESCO money. That's what most people think of. And then on the far right, the revolution brought a whole new line of architecture and art too. Next slide, please. So we saw quite a bit of the post-revolution sculptures. On the left was at the Revolutionary Square with Jose Marti, who's sort of the George Washington of Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And on the upper right was a revolutionary monument in Matanzas, and then the lower part was a small thing just outside the center for the Martin Luther King Center. So they're peppered throughout all the communities. They're very patriotic. They very much love their country a lot. Next slide. We had a real shift from that sort of thing on the first full night. Well, the second night we were there. Sandor and Jay took us to a place called the Fabrica de Arte Cubano, or the Art Factory. And it was a it was an enormous industrial site. It was a former cooking oil factory that they took over, and it was multi-leveled, very many rooms up and down and around all over the place. There were probably over 1,000 people in there, I would think. And they were all mostly under 30, so they took quite a look at us as we came in. It was a very hip kind of place. There was a lot of unusual art. You can see the entryway of the multi-layered place, and there were balconies and posters and art on the walls, and a giant screen for music and so forth. You can go to the next slide so you can see some of the contemporary art. Incredibly artistic and expressive. On the top left is a staged photograph of this gluttonous, white, heavyset man surrounded by food and surrounded in the back by his many servants. That's a spoof on the colonial period, I'm sure. On the right is sort of a counterculture kind of graffiti type painting, and on the lower part was a fish with strange objects inside the fish. I'm not too sure how to interpret. Next slide. The other place we went to on another evening was called the Mural Biondo, and it's making murals, and it has a pretty interesting story. During the special period in Cuba, which was the time of the fall of the Soviet Union in '91, and it really pulled out a major trading partner and pillar to their economy. So when the Soviet Union left, they were left high and dry, and there was a deep depression for 10 years. John and I went and visited there at that time, and it was quite an experience to be there at that time. The Cubans, the average Cuban lost around 30 pounds during that time. There was a lot of serious lack of food. So in the early 2000s, a group of neighbors in a certain area outside of Havana decided they needed to help lift some spirits, and they found there was a refuse pile in their neighborhood where people just dumped everything they didn't want. They decided to reclaim this dump, and they turned it into a gallery using all the refuse from the place. And it's hard to even explain, but everything there had been repurposed. John really would have loved this place. It was amazing. Like on that wall where he was the man who led us on the tour, those are all typewriters up on the walls. They did paper mache things like the Charlie Chaplin. They had incredible amount of stuff. And in the midst of uncovering all this trash, they found there was a huge tank that had been filled with this refuse. They turned that into a gallery and then put a roof on it, and they have a performance space on top. The artists and the volunteers also, their purpose is to provide classes for kids in the neighborhood, of course free. And their labor and their contributions have made this all happen. There's no government money involved in it. Can you go to the next one, Linda? This is some music that we heard that evening at the, where we had a concert by this group, and then we had dinner with another band to dance. Delegation who just couldn't keep himself off the floor, and he would drag other people out. It was really fun. Wonderful music. You can go to the next one. We also went to this slavery route museum that was mentioned earlier by Linda. They had a sculpture and visual arts exhibit, and it's a little bit hard to tell. I can't really quite describe it. The left-hand piece is a sculpture, and along what's kind of like a stockade, there are heads and hands being like in a stockade, what we would have seen in New England, and their bodies are on the other side, and they're decomposing in the soil. So that was sort of a comment about slavery during the plantation time. And on the right is a different sort of thing. It actually forms the map of Cuba. At the far end is the western tip, and at the closest is the eastern tip. And there's just a lot of map kind of things. They're very conscious of their contours. But the materials that make that map go from very black in the front to lighter and lighter to brown, which really is a comment on the skin color, because the eastern end of the island was where the plantations were and where the Afro-Colombians historically lived, and the far western part was the more multiracial people in the country, and where there's a lot of fishing and so forth. But they're very proud of who they are, no matter who they are, and they're very clear about their identities. Would you go to the next one? This is a little bit more about that. On the upper left it says my ancestors, and it shows this artist's various ancestors, and displaying their skin color is a wide range, even within their own family. And the lower right is sort of a cheeky Cuban. And this reminds me of our leader. He would always say, people! It was sort of a Sendor look. But he's got Cuba on his shirt. They're very proud people and incredibly expressive. Okay. The last place I'm going to talk about was in Matanzas, which was the town where the art school was and the slave museum. We were walking along this walkway that was along the harbor, and there was a lot of families, just like any place around here, like Uptown or whatever. But they had this row of metal sculptures that were intriguing. On the left is a very, very tall man, I think it is, on crutches. And he's dancing, he's jubilant, he's liberated, this man who's on these crutches. And on the right is of a pig. There are many art forms of pigs in Cuba. It's their most popular livestock. They eat a lot of pork. If they eat any meat, it usually is pork. And the meal we had today is made usually with shredded pork or shredded beef. But they're more likely to have pork. We had pork or bologna or hot dogs practically every day. If it wasn't fish, and the fish were served with their eyeballs, the whole thing. I had a bunch of those. At first it was a little hard, but they eat a lot of fish too. There's a lot of fishing around the island. And now, Diane.
It's really my turn. It's really my turn.
It really is your turn.
Oh, good. Okay. Do any of you remember who Tony Oliva is? Aha! He came from the very far western edge in that part of the island. Way down here is Guantanamo, or Guantanamo Bay. And from one end to the other is almost 800 miles. It covers about the landmass of Pennsylvania. And as we've heard, European explorers claimed the land for Spain in the early 1500s. And the indigenous people who lived there at that time were assimilated by marriage, died from disease, or were outright killed. The sugar cane was raised by enslaved African labor. There was sugar cane, tobacco, and coffee soon became their primary products. But as you know, you can't eat them, and they aren't very nutritious. So the Spanish had to import most of their food. And the items they grew, which is still fairly common in parts of Central America and South America, these foods were exported. So they sent out the sugar cane, tobacco, and coffee, and had to import food to eat. Very few Cubans have a spiritual connection to their land, as most of their ancestors came from Africa or Spain. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, U.S. corporations took over the economic interests of the island and continued to dominate the local people. Sugar production controlled up to 80% of the farmland. After the revolution in 1959, followed by the U.S. blockade, the Soviet Union, out of necessity, became Cuba's primary trading partner. The agrarian reform that divided the land up from the corporations into the individual farmers, there was a hope that those farmers, those new owners, would be able to diversify production. That only happened partially, and a lot of land is still fallow. Now the pandemic and inflation have taken a toll on the people. Food is very expensive and often rationed in the market. We were told you get 5 eggs a month per person. So there's a movement to encourage people to raise their own food for sale or for their own consumption. And here we have a quote from Tolstoy. Everyone thinks about changing the world, but nobody thinks about changing themselves. I love that picture. Okay, there we are. We then heard a presentation about the movement toward permaculture. They worked with 29 groups in 10 provinces. The permaculture movement in Cuba defines itself as the land and the people working together. It's intended to be mutually self-sustainable. And the Spanish there says, they aspire, this is my translation, I didn't ask anybody else. They aspire to produce changes that benefit families, locales, the country, and the world. Okay. Let's go beyond that then. Okay. We're now at the organic farm. There's a lot of urban farms and other farm education that's going on. We visited this particular farm. So they are trying to help provide a way for people to raise their own food and learn how to do that. So they're teaching organic farming. This is one of numerous farms that teach the younger generation how to farm. Produce is started from seed and is taken to the field for planting. They produce 90% of their own seeds. I think that's mostly out of necessity because they can't import them. National self-sufficiency is very important. Crops are planted by hand in small fields, making efficient use of space. Here they are learning how to make rich composted soil using worms. I will say we ate very well while we were there, better than the average Cuban, that's for sure. But we especially ate well when we were in the community. After visiting the organic farm, we had this meal outdoors under the hut. This was one of my favorite meals and was truly a feast. We had fish, meat, beans and rice, boiled yucca, and some fresh vegetables with fruit for dessert. We were told these were locally grown foods. Okay? The other farm we visited was more of a museum at this point, but coffee had been a major crop after the Haitian Revolution in 1820 when some French left Haiti and came to Cuba. This plantation was farmed by enslaved Africans under the strict oversight of their owner. It's part of the UNESCO slave route designation, and many of the buildings there are being taken back by nature. But this sacred tree here, where we're all circling it, it is not knocking down the walls of Jericho. This is a sacred ceiba tree, and it's been there for 250 years. They introduced to us a ritual that easily goes back to their early colonial era with enslaved Africans. We circled the tree 3 times and then knocked 3 times on the tree to make a wish. The man leading us was a practitioner of Santeria, which we learned is an Afro-Cuban religion. Coffee and rum are agricultural products of Cuba that cannot be exported to the United States due to the current blockade. We were told there is a steep fine. I don't remember how much, something like $2,000.
$10,000.
$10,000 fine for taking this back to the United States. So, of course, we had to consume the rum and coffee there. One aspect of Cuba that attracts developers is the beach. Because of the high tourist season, this beach would be full of people. There are huge hotels nearby. Those who work in the tourism industry will most likely get tips in dollars or euros. This currency allows them to make more money than many others and discourages them from farming, which is less lucrative. Tourism attracts gambling, prostitution, and other corruption. It also stimulates the economy, so it's a mixed bag. COVID, inflation, and the blockade have impacted tourism, but travelers from countries other than the US are able to vacation there. And we met some Canadians while we were out in the rural area. Permaculture makes use of all locations for growing things. For me, this stump symbolizes the new birth that we hope for Cuba as more grassroots farming can return to the island. The end. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to try to close this out by talking a little bit about the blockade first. As we mentioned earlier, the blockade was established in 1962 by President Kennedy, and it continues to this day, 60 years later. For 30 years, every year since 1992, the United Nations has taken a vote to end the blockade, but the US and Israel oppose it every single year. Everyone else would like to end it. It's just those 2 countries that oppose ending it. The blockade eased somewhat under the Obama administration, but was resumed and tightened even further under President Trump. The Miami Cuban community now consists of the children and grandchildren of the rich Cubans who fled after 1959. They believe that they should receive compensation for the income that was lost and the houses that were taken over by others, often their servants who were left behind after they left. This lobby is a very strong political force, especially as Florida has now become a vitally important state in US elections. The blockade has been extended so that even subsidiaries of US companies that operate in other countries are forbidden from trading with Cuba. We were told to bring our own toilet paper because it is unavailable in Cuba. Toilet paper, unavailable. Toilet seats are rare because they are so difficult to replace. The measurement between the 2 pegs is different on American toilets than it is on European and other toilets. And so the toilet seats that they can get from Europe don't fit the American toilets. Toilet mechanisms fail and cannot be replaced, as Lucia mentioned, happened to her and Nancy in their room. Old automobiles are held together with a wink and a prayer because it's so difficult to get new ones. And even though they are heavy polluters, people have no choice but to go on driving them. And you can see on that bottom photo, they have to improvise seats sometimes when the seat becomes so worn out. We're not quite sure about that seat. It could be there's a spring sticking up, perhaps, that they don't want to have to sit on. Next, please. Materials for building and street repair are exceedingly scarce, if not totally unavailable. Concrete, paint, and lumber are all scarce. So as you look around, the buildings are beginning to crumble, the sidewalks are crumbling, the cobblestones up there, you can see how those are breaking up. Over there on the left, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a wall there where the whole top of the wall is all moldy and beginning to crumble down. Food is rationed, and as Diane mentioned, some of us were staying in a home. 4 of us got omelets at breakfast 2 mornings in a row, and we realized that she had used up her entire month's ration and borrowed some eggs from somebody in order to feed us our 2 omelets. Next, please. So, do you want to talk about this, or? Well, these are some photos that Lynn took on a previous trip compared to photos on this trip. This is actually the same community center. If you compare the photo on the left, when the community center was newly painted, looking bright and fresh and wonderful, and up in the top right is what it looks like now, where they can't get anything to repair it, it's fading, it's crumbling. Yeah, next one, right? Unless you want to say anything more about it. And then, yeah, this is the pool. On the left, you can see that it's ready to be filled with water, and it looks pretty good, and the building, the community center next to it is all painted and fresh. On the right, look at the surface of the pool there. It's crumbling and cracked and full of weeds, and they can't get the materials to fix it or do anything with it. So, in conclusion, and I'm going to sort of speak for the group, so please forgive me, the other 5 of you, if I do anything I shouldn't. It became very clear to all of us pretty quickly that the US blockade is really a totally unsuccessful strategy from anybody's point of view. The original goal of the blockade was to push the Cuban people to rebel against the Castro government. But 60 years later, the Cuban people remain united. They're proud of their country, and they have no intention of giving in to the blockade. None at all. In every place we visited, and every person who spoke to us, we heard the phrase, "for the benefit of all," over and over and over again. Their national mindset is focused on sharing and collaboration. The only restrictions we experienced were US restrictions, not Cuban. In Cuba, we were told we could go anywhere we wanted to, talk to anybody we wanted to. There were very, very few guns in Cuba and no visible police presence. We felt totally safe everywhere we went, day and night. And we've talked about this, that a response a lot of people get after they've been to Cuba, oh, well, they just hid the bad stuff from you. But why would they tell us we could go anywhere we wanted to and talk to anyone we wanted to if they were trying to hide things? There are illogical rationales used to justify the blockade. Cuba is communist. No, it's not. Cuba supports terrorism. No, it doesn't. Cuba hasn't repaid the companies that were nationalized 60 years ago. But remember, those companies took land and resources from the Cuban people in the first place. One of the conditions for releasing the blockade is that Cuba must form a 2-party system. But remember the process that Lucia and Nancy described for creating the family code. Extensive feedback on the local level, several drafts that went back and forth to the government, to the local level, to the government, and then finally a fully participated vote, nationwide vote. That was far more democratic than what we see in Washington right now. So how can we dictate what system would be best for them when our own system really isn't working very well at the moment? The blockade has also evolved into a humanitarian issue. For example, during the early days of COVID, the US refused Cuba's appeal for oxygen and respirators. Just think about that. The US also refused Cuba's offer to send doctors to the US to help after Hurricane Katrina. They didn't even want Cuban help. The blockade prevents US citizens from benefiting from trade with Cuba and from dramatic medical and educational achievements that are available in Cuba, but not here because they're not allowed here. We heard one doctor say, the US government doesn't want to see that the whole world could be better off if Cuba were allowed to share its gifts and its knowledge. So basically, I'll leave you with what we were left with, which is a strong belief that the US is basically trying to squeeze Cuba to death with no clear benefit to anyone.